So, this is impacts of the French and Indian War on the British Empire by
Jared Maynard.
Owen Roth.
And Thomas Chappelle. Let's just get into this. Project Google Doc, just in there. Not important to you guys at all. Just
So, for context, the French and British competed for economic, political, uh, religious, and military power in Europe and competed for land for colonies in the Americas. Uh, the cause of all of these impacts, the French and Indian War, which was the name in the colonies. Uh, in Europe, it was known as the Seven Years' War. It lasted from 1756 to 1763. It was caused by conflict over land in the Ohio Valley between the French and the British. The British were encroaching on land owned by French west of the British colonies. The French drove the British off. George Washington, was sent with the militia to protest, but instead of peacefully protesting, they killed the French that were sent to warn the British. This would spread to Europe and become a world war. Uh, the French will win the first part of the war because they were allied with most of the Native American tribes, while the British were only allied with the Iroquois, uh, and they knew more of the interior of North America than the British. Uh, However, the British would eventually win, mainly because of William Pitt, who enacted mass mobilization, meaning he would fund the British war effort, move troops to block ports so French troops could not get resources, and he sends more British troops to America.
All right. So, the who, it's not really too much to cover. The British, the French, and the Native Americans involved in the war. The what is obviously the French and Indian War, which it's kind of got two different names for it. So, as Jared mentioned, it started with Britain having control over their colonies, pushing west, and the French they were to the west. They didn't really get along very well, and eventually the war was kicked off, and that conflict, the French and Indian War, eventually developed into the 7 Years' War, which was more of a global scale conflict. So, what is our French and Indian War / 7 Years'
on to the when. The war lasted from about the early 1754 to February 10th of 1763, ending with the Treaty of Paris. I'll get to the year later on, but the exact beginning of the war is can only really speculate, as there are many skirmishes around that time. So you can choose any of these as the beginning of the war, but the war kicked off over in Europe in India in 1756, ending again at the same date in 1763. So it's also being called the 7 Years' War over a wider scale because, again, 7 years long is very creative. But our Treaty of Paris is, as I said, the February 10th of 1763, making it the Treaty of Paris of 1763, which you can see there were many Treaties of Paris's, and we're talking about the one right here, because then one before that established a third Bourbon family. Don't know what that means. And the one after that is that very special one about the American Revolution. But now, onto the where. This, as you know, took place entirely within North America, or at least the French and Indian War part, specifically the Ohio River Valley, eastern Pennsylvania, New York, as well as north in what was then New France in Quebec and Montreal, as those cities were both captured during the war. And as I said, the war took place in Europe and India as well, but the impacts only took place for the British in all of these places, as well also adding in Florida, as well as all land east of the Mississippi River. You can see I have a small map down the bottom right here, and as you can see, Florida was Spanish, but as part of the treaty, it was then given to the British. They got everything east of the Mississippi here. All this was added to the Hudson Bay Company, all that. But then this map as well is also very bad, as not only does it not include any of Central and South America as existing, but also gives Spain all of the west coast, including all the way to the tip of Alaska. So it's not a very good map, but it gets the point across of how much the French had controlled, where they controlled it, and how they no longer ended up having that at the end of the impact of this war to the British is very good success.
So here are the impacts of the French and Indian War on the British Empire. The first of all, going into detail about what ended the French and Indian War, because it would give Britain something very important. Treaty of Paris of 1763, as Thomas pointed out, there are many, specifically talking about this one. In this, France gives up all of its territory in mainland North America, and Britain receives Quebec and the Ohio Valley. The French and Indian War was incredibly expensive for Britain, so it left Britain in an enormous amount of debt. Britain would increase its authority over its American colonies, since they literally protected them from the French, and this would increase tensions between the American colonies and Britain. Examples of this are the Proclamation of 1763 was created by Britain at the end of the French and Indian War. It made settlement west of the Proclamation line, which was across the Appalachian Mountains, forbidden. And this was done to prevent American colonists from encroaching on Native American land and causing more conflict. Taxes were imposed on the American colonies to pay for the war debt. Here's a popular quote: "No taxation without representation." And for context, the American colonies did not have any representation in the British Parliament. Next slide. Here's another example of increased British authority. The British imposed a currency shortage on the colonies. Most of the British colonist trade was with Britain, who was not supplying money, so cash only came from trade with other countries, and this caused internal colonial trade to resort to butter, nails, pitch, and feathers for makeshift currency. And all of these factors would lead to colonial rebellion, a popular example being the Boston Tea Party. And colonial rebellion would eventually lead to a war between Britain and its American colonies for American independence, otherwise known as the American Revolution.
So thank
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hope you all enjoyed that. Remember, the sun never sets on the British Empire. God save the Queen, all that.
But it does.
It doesn't. It never does. We'll see all of you in the...
I think it does. I think it does.
Hope you enjoyed it. Learned a thing or two.